multiple places. There's really no one place that I can say I would go back home to. I was born in Winnipeg, which is in the middle of Canada, in the prairies. My dad is third generation Canadian. My mom is German. And my family moved to Germany when I was very young, when I was just a few weeks old. So my childhood until I was 12 years old was in Germany in south of Munich, so near the Alps, not so much near the oceans, which is the salty water is what I'm mostly working on nowadays. So I spent my early formative years in Bavaria, in the foothills of the Alps. But my grandparents were running a small business on the coast of Spain in the Costa Brava region. So on many holidays as a little kid, there's lots of pictures of me running along the beaches, along the Costa Brava in Spain, playing in the ocean and just loving being by the sea with all the sounds and noises and wonderfully fabulous marine creatures that go along with it. I was also living in Germany, and this, I guess this isn't directly related to water, but in general, in my interest in improving the environment for people and for nature. I was living in Germany at the time that the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl happened, and that whole radioactive cloud went right over where we were living. And I think I was 11 or 12 at the time, so it gave me a real sense of how easily disasters can happen that impact all of us very quickly in ways that we might not be able to anticipate at all. And so that partly created a desire of wanting to influence things for the better. And I've always loved just being outside and playing outside. Any moment that I had as a kid, you wouldn't find me indoors. You would find me climbing trees and playing in the dirt and swimming in the lakes and all of those things. So my interest in the outdoor world and in realizing the environmental challenges that faced us really is what made me interested in pursuing a career related to environmental issues. And then when I was 12, my family moved to the United States. So I had a bit of a culture shock moving from rural Bavaria to suburban Atlanta, Georgia. And I went to middle and high school in Atlanta. And one of the formative teachers I had was my geography teacher, who was brought together studies in international development, the environment, and inspired me to be interested in that and led me to pursue geography as my degree when I then moved to, I suppose, my native, where I was born, country of Canada, for university. So I moved to Montreal when I was 18 to start university and picked geography as a very interdisciplinary home where I was interested in both the social and the natural sciences, thinking about challenges in the world, both from better understanding nature and ecosystems, but also really valuing people and people's places within that environment and all of those connections that exist. I still, those formative years and studies still make me really strongly believe that we can't fully understand these issues if we only look at human social issues, and if we only look at environmental issues. They're so connected that we really need to be looking at both. Yeah, so I studied both my undergraduate and my master's degree in geography at McGill University in Montreal. And I had an amazing opportunity to work with a professor there who was doing his research in the Peruvian Amazon. And so for 2 summers, both for my undergraduate thesis and for my master's thesis, I had the amazing experience of going to Peru outside of the city of Iquitos, like very small rural communities that at the time didn't have power. I mean, no cell service, no telephone lines, sort of quite remote, but connected by the rivers. So there's a bit of a water thread there, and the riverside living in the seasonality of that river, where the Amazon and the tributaries to the Amazon change by meters between the dry season and the wet season. And again, that was at the time, the topic is not related to much that I do now, but it was interested in understanding why some people have much more diversity in their home gardens than others. And it really came down to lots of social networks among people and using the river to connect to neighboring villages and some of the paths, and especially the soccer games that would be the social connectors amongst villages. But at the same time, being Canadian, having my origins in Europe, I felt like too much of an outsider jumping into a different culture is to study something of interest. And the professor I was working with has a very long-term relationship there. But it still felt a bit strange to me. It was just a little weird. And so I ended up finishing my degree and I moved to in British Columbia, which is where I'm living now on the west coast of Canada with my husband. And I just fell in love with this place of British Columbia. It's the scenic beauty of the mountains meeting the sea, and the history of the people and the culture here was just amazing. And I immediately felt at home. So I made my home in Vancouver at the time and ended up pursuing my PhD there. And also partly through work, I was working for a not-for-profit organization, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, the British Columbia chapter, for 4 years. And that really opened my eyes and a door into the world of marine conservation and the oceans. It made me realize just how little we know about the oceans and all the fascinating creatures that live within it. Still, almost every day you can get news that some new species was discovered and some amazing alien-looking creature that just should exist only in the movies is actually there, and we don't even know about it. That, and also a fascination with the ocean, because people rely on the ocean, but we don't quite live in the ocean in the same way that we do on land. So it brings a different dimension of challenges and understanding in that relationship between people and nature when you're talking about the ocean. So I, partly through my work, I had this fascination of the ocean start, and I decided I wanted to go back to school to do my PhD because I'd always valued research and was interested in that as a potential career. So I did my PhD. And through my previous work, I had many connections with people interested in marine conservation and ocean management in British Columbia, including amongst Indigenous peoples, or First Nations, as we say in this part of Canada. And so my PhD was in partnership with a couple of First Nations, and one with whom I'm still doing a lot of work today with the Gitga'at Nation on the north coast of British Columbia. And that was my early days of seeing research not as only an academic endeavor that is, the professor or the student being the sage on the stage, asking the questions, going out, pursuing knowledge and coming up with some answer, but rather as an opportunity to use the resources that exist in academia to answer questions that people that are facing these challenges have. And in my case, that meant partnering with First Nations and co-creating research questions, research approaches, the data collection, doing that in partnership, even analyses, feeding back to the communities, getting feedback. And that's how I've pursued research ever since, for the most part, because I don't do research for the sake of getting publications. We have to do that to advance. But I do it because I want to have an impact. Like, I want to have a real in the water impact of the efforts that I and my students and my team do. So that interest at that time made me realize that this is what I really wanted to do, and that in my ideal world, I would find a job in British Columbia to pursue studies, to pursue research here. But I also realized that within academia, it can be so competitive that if you've gotten your PhD from one place, the chances of getting a job in that similar place is fairly small. So I decided that it would be wise to do a postdoctoral fellowship overseas, and one of the big icons of marine conservation in the world is Australia and the Great Barrier Reef in particular. So I picked up things, and my husband and I moved to Australia, to Townsville, James Cook University, in Queensland, near the Great Barrier Reef. And I spent 4 years there, better understanding both what Australia is doing with its marine conservation efforts and the many other efforts that they support. So had students doing a number of different studies and partnerships in the Coral Triangle region, for instance. And then I like my plan A, my hope was to go away, be good enough to then get a job back in British Columbia. And I didn't have a plan B. And somehow plan A worked out. This job at the University of Victoria, which is where I'm at now, came up, and I thought, I don't know if I have a chance, but it sounds so good, I'm just going to try. And I ended up getting it. So it's now been 10 years since I've moved back to Canada, having made my home in British Columbia, and continue to do almost all of my work in partnership, most of it with First Nations, but also with others, sometimes with government agencies, with local NGOs, with stakeholder groups, and so on. So that's kind of my roundabout way of telling the story of where I am at now. So on the question of storytelling, I do a lot of listening to stories, because a lot of the way in which people that I'm partnering with talk about things they're experiencing is through stories. And the oral tradition of telling stories is very much alive in the Indigenous communities with whom I'm partnering. So even when I'm doing research or asking specific questions, often the answer actually comes in the form of a story. And it might not be a direct answer. It might be a story where it's up to me to do the work to figure out what was actually meant by that. I do think about the academic papers that I'm publishing as stories. And when I work with students, I tell them you have to find out what story you're wanting to tell with this piece so that it's actually readable and not just, something that is going to sit on some server and nobody's ever going to look at. I've worked a fair bit with journalists who are actually professionals at storytelling to tell aspects of the stories that I've been working on, and also so they can tell a fuller story than I might be able to by making others that are key players a part of that story. So I'd say, yeah, there's elements of storytelling, but I wouldn't call myself a great storyteller or that that's a particular skill that I have, but I really value it. So I try to work with people who know how to do that better. Stories are so important though. And so the listening to stories is one of the things that I enjoy the most when I get a chance to visit the partnering communities. That's a hard question. There's multiple things I'm proud of. Maybe I'll mention a couple. So I think what makes me the most proud is when I see aspects of my research making a real tangible difference. One example of that is, and I only played a very small part of this story, but one example is a project that I partnered with on the central coast of British Columbia that related to an important food species, Dungeness crab. And as part of the interviews that I did and sort of documenting the declines in that fishery, it ended up resulting in the closures for recreational and commercial fishing that these Indigenous peoples had been asking for more than a decade. And so I felt like the academic piece that I was able to provide and have peer reviewed in partnership with them and co-authoring with them actually led to some on the water changes, and that makes me proud. And similarly, when people talk to one another, and so I also have a bit of, I feel good about what I've been managing to accomplish when I get, I guess you could call it referrals almost, but sort of out of the blue contacts from other Indigenous people saying, we hear you, we might be able to partner on doing some work together. because it shows that I've been able to achieve some of that trust that word of mouth passes on, and people feel like they can contact me and ask about potential things, and that is also something I'm proud of. The other thing I'm really proud of is the amazing graduate students and just students in general that I get to work with. There's so many awesome people out there, and seeing them thrive and taking their place in a lot of these partnerships. Like, I wouldn't be able to do nearly like hardly anything if it wasn't for a team of people that I'm working with. That's the collaborators and also the students, and so I can help them have ideas and think about ways to do things, but they're the doers and they're the ones that are out there. So I'm super proud of them all for the amazing work and dedication that they all have, and the way that they're all team players. Yeah, it's hard to say. I felt like I've had a lot of support throughout my career from some amazing mentors. And so I feel like I haven't faced some of the challenges that I hear from my, especially women peers, that they faced, because I've always had champions for me. And I really value that, as throughout like all of the studies that I've done, from my undergrad and master's supervisor to my PhD supervisor, Amanda Vincent, who's a real champion of women in science. And when I was a postdoc at James Cook University, my mentors there opened a lot of doors and connected me with other networks of people that led to collaborations that continue to this day. So I feel like I've had it easy given the challenges that many others face, and it is because of these amazing mentors that have been there for me and have opened doors for me. So I try to follow that path and attempt to do the same for the people that I'm working with now. They've also been really great at providing me with recommendations or opportunities. So being able to apply for things, whether it's grants or chair positions or all of those things. So I feel like I've had a ton of support. Some of the main challenges are probably ones we've just talked about to some extent. It's my own reluctance to be in the spotlight has probably closed doors for me, that if I was more outgoing or more of a more interested in being in the spotlight, that maybe I would have achieved other things that I just haven't been interested in because I didn't want that role. Yeah, no, I've been part of a couple of training programs as well that have really helped in terms of both meeting similar people that are thinking about similar things, and also realizing that, like, especially a lot of women think along similar lines. So it's definitely not unique. But yeah, it was the Compass Leaders for Sea Change was one of those programs. It was during the pandemic, so it all ended up being online, which is too bad. And then there's the Earth Leadership, which is run by Future Earth. That one of the other, when I filled in my name, I recognized one of the other names on the list, because Nandita is a fellow, Future Earth fellow. So I recognized that name, which was wonderful. But yes, I've been getting used to tooting my own horn when writing grant applications. And it's one of the things that I really dislike doing, but you sort of just get on with it and try to get good at it. Doing, and I think some people aspire to be the greatest scientist and write only articles for Science and Nature, but I really don't care. I want to have that impact, and I think it takes the kind of leader that I am, which is much more humble and not like look at me sort of a person, that is able to have successful partnerships and co-create research and allow others to have a big voice in and shape what I do. I think that it takes a certain personality to want to do that and to be good at it. I've been always trying to prioritize what is important to me in order to not get overwhelmed and to, have a bit of a work-life balance. Throughout, even during my PhD, I kind of considered it to be sort of like work, where I never wanted to work 100% of the time. I know I'm most productive when I'm focused for a certain number of hours during the day working and then not thinking about work. If I try to work all the time, I'm just ineffective and slower. So then it wastes more time. I just still love being outside. So going for walks, runs, hiking, sea kayaking, skiing in the winter, all of those things take my mind off the pressing things at work and allow me to be refreshed and look at things with a new perspective. And so I think I would have a really hard time if I had to be just cooped up inside and wasn't able to get that fresh air outside thinking time. So yeah, I think just realizing what's important to me and to the people that I'm working with as the main priorities and trying not to have all of the many requests that might come my way take priority over what really matters. Sometimes that's easier said than done. It's going to sound kind of cheesy, but it's really, there's so many things that are possible to do with one's life and just to pursue those dreams. Like, I didn't think when I was younger that I would be a professor. My siblings also did their PhDs, but that was the first generation that was pursuing academia or more advanced from undergraduate onward studies. So it wasn't something that was really on my radar as a career or job that I thought I would do. But yet with the interest and the passion in the topic and support from my family and the mentors that I've met throughout, I'm here and following those dreams and living in the place where I want to live, which again in academia doesn't always happen. It's all possible. It can be hard, but it's possible. And so really figuring out what it is that you want to do, what your own priorities are, what you want to achieve with your work life. Those are hard questions, but those are so important to ask, because if you don't ask them, then you just might never be happy with what you're doing. Let me think about that for 1 minute. I guess there's multiple examples, and I try to have to at least think about the gender dynamics and all of the work that I do. There's one project in particular that's led by a postdoctoral fellow, Sarah Harper, in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and in particular with Emily Darling from WCS. And she is in particular, her expertise is in gender and gender analyses in the, especially in the fisheries world. And so this particular project, the partner organization, the Wildlife Conservation Society, has been collecting information from projects that they do for a number of years in 6 different countries, I think it is, that she's working with, that included a few questions that relate to gender. And so she's analyzing whether women and men in particular have different perspectives as it relates to resource management, how they feel they're affected by resource management, to see if there are things that we might be missing when we recommend certain kinds of management measures in the hopes that they're going to make things better, when in fact they might actually worsen the lives of women much more so than men. So that's one specific example. That's a project that actually has a specific gender lens. Another, I would say, is in some of the work that I do in communities, in Indigenous communities here in British Columbia, is to, when possible, find, when I have the funds and the ability to have community assistance with the work, like to hire somebody to help out, I often try to find young women to help, because it provides a different lens into the community. It supports them, and it can help to shape the women leaders of the future as well. At home, I try to do as much as possible. I commute by bicycle. These are all the small things that I do in my own life. I bike. We installed solar panels a couple of years ago, so our house is on solar. We just installed heat pumps that are much more efficient than the heating that we had before. But these are all minor things, and they almost make it seem as though the responsibility is only on the individual. I would say probably the biggest thing that I do in terms of trying to work towards a more sustainable world is to talk about a lot of the structural barriers that our society faces in being more sustainable amongst the university classes and the program in general, environmental studies at the University of Victoria. I personally fail by flying too much, like going to conferences and meetings, and even the field work that I do requires flying and taking float planes. And so on a day-to-day basis at home, I do very well, but when it comes to my overall footprint, it's not great. I can't say that I really have a mantra per se. As one of these leadership trainings that I was part of, we were trying to come up with like a couple of words or a phrase that encompass our vision of what we might want to do. And the one that that resonates to some extent is uplifting voices. So really trying to uplift others. And that's also voices most interpreted in a very general way. So that can include non-human beings and voices. So I do feel that that's what I try to do, is to uplift the voices of others in as much as possible. And often that means being entirely comfortable with my voice not being the one that's heard, but actually letting others um, get the experience of being in the spotlight and just being able to elevate them to levels that maybe they wouldn't be at if I didn't provide some opportunities.